I asked Harold, with 10 being the worst in terms of poor facilities and poor response and health and safety concerns and those kinds of things, where would LHA fall? Harold's response was at a 1 or 0. I mean, we are immediately responsive. We maintain the facilities, and yet all the costs we're talking about creating will have to ultimately be paid by LHA residents. In a keep going.
Why'd you do this?
It's commensurate to whatever those costs are, because I know who's going to end up paying them.
The renters. So this is Longmont City Council. Longmont City Council study session, June 1st, 2021. They started streaming an hour and a half ago, so 4 people are watching.
Planning and code enforcement. And I sat down this afternoon to just make a list of.
And there's 10 council people or 10 like important people that's on the Zoom call.
Since just in the time I've been on the council, since 2018, as fairly significant projects that not all of which the council directed, but have been created for a staff that is currently implemented. And here's the short list. The first and main transportation hub, planning, financing, what that is going to require. We are trying to manage the projects being implemented as a result of the 2018 bond election with spiraling costs. It looks to me, and I think to the staff, like there was not enough money in that bond to cover all that we were trying to get done. So we have staff scrambling with project management and construction management on the facilities currently underway, and problems to be solved with the fire stations and the recreation facilities, etc. The adaptation of the sustainability evaluation system and its implementation, the Climate Action Task Force resolution and recommendations, Costco and its economic benefits to the city, but with implications for finance, public works, housing, attorney, the city manager, quiet zones, Longmont Housing Authority, which we have assumed, right, we've taken over in the interest of our residents to keep their costs down and to maintain quality housing. The updates on short-term rentals, accessory dwelling units, and RV ordinances, 2 feasibility studies, updates to our land code with specific attention to design standards, the STEAM and Main Street vision projects, and we're going to talk about the breadth and scope of the Main Street Corridor Plan later on this agenda, which is, pretty dramatic in scope. The Wildlife Management Plan and protection of our riparian corridors, the inclusionary housing ordinance, where the hard work is in the implementation, much beyond the time that the staff spent just to get us the ordinance. Medical marijuana, both licensing and delivery. Multimodal plans with specific attention to bike lanes. Button Rock Management Plan. Windy Gap, Chimney Hollows, the planning and litigation that goes along with that. Not to mention prairie dogs. And all of that happening in the context of a once-in-a-century pandemic. And all of the personnel, financial management, facilities management challenges that go along with that. My point is, if we're going to do this, we got to take a hard look at this list and decide which of the things that we created on this list come off the list.
It's about time.
To add one more major thing, in addition to what we've already done, to a staff that is stretched pretty thin right now, seems to me to be irresponsible if we're not willing to say there's some abandonment we need to do. This is more important. Whatever we're talking about doing with rental licensing has to be more important than what's on the list. If we're going to add it to the list, we ought to take something off. Now, I got a bunch of other questions about costs, benefits, how we would evaluate the effects of our ordinance, how other municipalities have evaluated the effects of theirs if we go farther with this. But I'm telling you, this feels like a huge, huge hammer for I'm not certain how big of a nail. And I'd like more information, more evidence of the magnitude of the problem before I'm going to get behind a program that's going to create costs for our residents and another significant burden for the city.
Hell yeah, bald white man, fucking A. Hunter S. Thompson, L. Longmont.
Thank you, Councilmember Waters. Just a reminder, the speaking order is still Councilmember Christensen next, Councilmember Martin, and Councilmember Hidalgo Faring. I encourage anybody to go beyond opining and make a motion. otherwise, I mean, I will make a motion after this next three speakers. So, Councilmember Christensen.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I will make a motion. I think
It was Councilman Waters.
to hire 2 more extra people and to actually understand the cost, the problems with our housing when we are in the midst of a huge housing crisis. 58% of the people renting cannot afford to rent. They at least deserve to have safe and decent housing. And it's up to us as the people who are doing this to, who are in charge of policy, to be sure that the residents of the city have safe and decent housing. There's nothing really more important to me than that the residents have a safe and decent city
Nice.
to live in.
Longmont.
So I think
Colorado.
$100,000 that can be factored out, which it's $40 for an inspection a year, every 2 years. That would be about $2 a month. I think people can afford that. Plus, this is tax deductible for the landlord. They don't need to pass this on to the tenant at all. Anyway, I really think this is extremely important that we have a database, that we know what's going on here, that we have licenses. Many cities this size have done this since the 50s. I mean, this is not a new thing. We've just been ignoring it for a very long time, and we need to not ignore it anymore, because for the last 8 years I have gotten lots and lots and lots of complaints about housing, about landlords, and also about houses that are not being taken care of by my neighbors. And so they don't complain to their landlord because they're afraid of losing their house. They complain to everybody else, but they don't complain because they're afraid that they'll be thrown out. So I don't think it's just 60 complaints a year. That's the problem of having it be something that has to go through time that a tenant has to take off to go through meetings, time that a tenant has to go off in filing paperwork, and the fear that a tenant has when they're not being taken care of. And as Councilwoman Peck said, this upholds the landlord's ability to say, you know, when you moved in, everything was working fine. Now I am spending a small fortune to repair this and this and this. So clearly, you've done something that is costing money. So I would move that we move forward with this. I would move forward. I would direct staff, to bring forth an ordinance in which we decide what kind of housing would be attached and what the schedule for inspections would be. I think if we put it off for every 3 years, it would cost less. And rough expenses for what that would be. I think Mr. Van Nimwegen gave us some pretty fair assessments of how much this would cost for both the inspection and the license. I would expect the license and the inspection to be at the very least that we can charge and still make this at least partially self-financing. So, do I have a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion on the floor that directs staff to bring forward an ordinance with, to paraphrase, definitive measurables, many of which were outlined by Councilmember Christensen. I think there are many that council would like to hear. For the sake of the speaking order, I would still like to continue on with who I have in the queue, and because we have now have a motion and a second, if we can try to limit our questions and opinions to the motion. That would be helpful as well, please. So at this time, Councilmember Martin.
Yes, thank you. First, I would like to say to the public, landlords and tenants, that, as Councilmember Peck pointed out, this is for all of you, but for the for the persons that I think are most at risk. I spend about 2 hours a day doing direct outreach to residents, most of whom are renters, and I hear over and over and over again that they are afraid to complain to their landlords. And there was a really clear-cut sort of divide between low-income residents who do not have good relations with their landlords, and maybe they're afraid because they're late with the rent sometimes, you know, and their landlord thinks maybe they can do better the next time. And then, you know, more affluent or at least more comfortable, secure renters have perfectly fine relationships with their landlords. And actually, that's the experience that I have as a person who has been up and down in terms of my personal fortunes. When I was down, I had trouble with my landlords, and when I wasn't down, it was all just fine. And I'm not very scared of confronting landlords, so I suspect it's worse for a lot of people. But to address Councilmember Waters' concerns, I think, first of all, that this is not the scale of many of the other initiatives that he was comparing it to. And second, that this is a matter of infrastructure like potholes and sidewalks and streetlights.
I don't know the issue.
It is something that a city does.
What are they debating? I don't know. But it's between renters and landlords.
Necessarily mean that it would not achieve economies if it did do it, and that landlords wouldn't. You know, the good landlords that I talked to, they said, well, you know, I make sure that I maintain my properties every couple of years no matter what, because if I let it go, it gets old, and then the costs are higher. So if on the older buildings we inspected and produced lists of needed repairs, it would probably end up in the long term saving landlords who tend to put things off money. I also think
5 more minutes, Longmont City Council. I expect you to get something done. 5 more minutes.
Of housing stock that we would develop by licensing rentals, that it would tell us things that we don't know now, like the density of rental properties in different neighborhoods, and the condition of our rental properties, and you know, and many other things. You know, we've all of us complained at one time or another that when we're talking about affordable housing, we're not really sure what we've got. And we hear a lot about the need, but it's very hard to quantify. So I really like the idea of anything that is going to help us quantify it. And then that's why I believe that we should continue in this assessment. I don't know whether a friendly amendment is needed or not. Councilmember Christensen, you can talk about that. We may not be yet in a position to go straight to an ordinance. And I could see this happening as several incremental ordinances, you know, just to make sure that we get it right, but to make a start on it, that it be the initiative. That is just my opinion. We could get something basic, ordinance immediately. It sounds like that's what Councilmember Christensen would prefer. But you know, I think this is enough.
That's a good weed, Mayor Colorado.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Hidalgo Ferring.
Okay, thank you. So I did see on one of our options was to let staff I'm wondering if that would already be in that component. So if that's the case, I don't think it would be necessary to have an amendment, because that would be the next step in the process, is to gather that information and draft the budget. The question I have is around the, to collect landlord input on inspection preference. Would they want the city to be providing that, or would they prefer to have, hire their own inspectors? So, I think we really need to guide what the overall preference of our landlords are. So I think that should be something that is included in the input. The other thing is, I heartily agree with Councilmember Martin, Councilmember Peck, and Councilmember Christensen, and, to have these numbers quantified. A large portion of our population rent their homes. These are our constituents. So we need to be able to have data on what's happening in these places. And, over several years, because I rent my home, and I've had some great homes, and I've had some. There was one home where we lasted 3 weeks in there. It ended up having, and we had someone come in and do a mold assessment on the house. It was 80% mold. My kids were sick. My husband got really sick. We essentially evacuated the home. So in that particular case, that could have been one that would have been resolved through an inspection. And even, you kind of smelled it when you went down into the basement. It kind of had that musty smell. But, our kids, more than half my family got really sick. And that one I did, like Councilmember Martin, I have no problem going to the landlord and saying, hey. But over the years, I've talked to, and it was predominantly low income, 20-something, young, just out of the house, leaving their parents' homes and renting on their own, and are lower income and second language learners, where English is not their primary language. Just concerns after concerns. One of the apartment complexes, and this is where my daughter used to live, they actually had bungee cords holding up the stair rail in the apartment. And I think they recently had gotten it fixed, because I said something. And then another apartment that I had spoken with the residents, that the front door going into the complex was broken. So anyone could have access coming into those apartment complexes. Another one, this was a single-family home, gas, the smell of gas. And in all these cases, tenants were afraid to say something. They were afraid that their leases were not going to be renewed. They were afraid that their rates would go up if they complained. So retribution. So, I have a question, if anybody knows, are there any types of protections? I know we have whistleblower protections for employees. Are there any type of tenant protections if they report something in regard to substandard housing or safety issues? So if there's somebody in staff that could, Glenn, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez and Councilmember Hidalgo Ferring. Maybe I'll ask Susan, who is, her internet is knocked out by the storm, but she is on the phone, and I think there are a renter bill of rights, but maybe Susan could address that.
I'm here.
Please continue.
Should I talk?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, this is Susan. The new warranty of habitability, which is a state law, does have provisions prohibiting retaliation, and it has some quite vigorous penalties for retaliation. Of course, retaliation is a state of mind, and sometimes it's hard to prove that. But I wanted to address something that Councilwoman Hidalgo Ferring talked about, which is mold. And I don't think that the IPMC or our code officers actually inspect for mold. So that is the one issue that I hear the most about.
Yeah.
And it is the one issue that we don't have the ability to address through our inspections. Although there is quite a strong law, a state law, requiring landlords to engage with the mold on a strict timeline. That's not something that at present our code officers would address. Can I say a couple of other things?
Please do.
Okay, I'm not a policy person. Everything I'm talking about is based on anecdote, but believe me, I've heard thousands and thousands of anecdotes. I don't perceive that there's a great fear on the part of tenants. Of course, there is sometimes, but that would always be the case. But I think that what I'd like to see, I kind of have this vision. Longmont already has the structure set up. We have a strong crime-free program. We have a strong landlord-tenant housing retention and mediation program already set up. We have the basic setup for what I foresee as we could actually create a mediation-centered approach to the landlord-tenant relationship. And I'm not saying that there's not role for enforcement and not role for litigation, which of course is what Boulder's going down that road. But I really do think that we could have a different kind of vision about how to strengthen the rental situation and the landlord-tenant relationship in our city. I would like to see kind of like a housing ombudsman office, not just rental licensing. And when we're talking about this whole rental licensing thing, we're talking about several different things. There's registration, which addresses the database. A part of that would be having some kind of an agent of record on hand for law enforcement.